Hi, everyone. The Cold War, which developed after World War II, dramatically shaped the way that Americans thought about foreign affairs. But it's important to understand that it wasn't just limited to diplomatic relations. The Cold War also shaped the way that Americans viewed themselves, and it also had a huge impact on American society. So, most notably, the impact that it had on American society relates to something that's called the Second Red Scare. Now, the Second Red Scare is a period of anti communist hysteria that gripped the United States after World War II. Now, at its core, the Cold War was a war of ideas, which sought to win over the hearts and minds of people around the world. To many Americans, the Cold War represented a simple choice between the freedom being promised by the United States and the collectivism and industrial slavery represented by communism. As the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union deteriorated after World War II, many Americans began to view communism as incompatible with the values of the United States. Many citizens began to worry that communist spies had infiltrated the United States and were actively working to undermine our government, as well as our policies and our goals around the world. Now, these fears caused Americans to draw a sharp distinction between patriotic Americans and those who might be considered to be disloyal. And suddenly, any dissension, anyone who had ideas outside of the norm were viewed as suspicious, and it is viewed as maybe a threat to freedom and national security. So it's important for us to get a little background on this before we jump into how the Cold War played out. Not all of the fears of the Cold War were completely unfounded. There is evidence to suggest that there were Soviet spies who had infiltrated certain government agencies in the 1930s, though most historians agree that by the 1940s, many of them had been rooted out and no longer represented a significant presence within the US government. There was also a formal Communist Party within the United States. Known as Communist Party USA. However, at its peak in the early 1940s, it never had more than 100,000 members, making it a relatively small and uninfluential organization. But it's important to understand that in the context of the Cold War, the existence of any dissent, especially communist organization within America, was viewed as a threat to the very existence of the United States. So, as the United States took a hard line against communism abroad, there was also pressure on our government to contain communism here at home as well. US leaders began to take action to weed out communism within American society. And in 1947, President Truman issued the Executive Order 9835, which launched a loyalty security program within the government. Under this program, the Attorney General's office compiled lists of subversive organizations and prior involvement in these groups, as well as participation in protests or labor strikes, became grounds for suspicion. Now, the Loyalty Security Program analyzed the allegiances of more than 5 million federal employees between 1947 and 1956. And as a result, about 2,700 employees were deemed to be of questionable loyalty and were dismissed, while another 12,000 resigned in protest of the civil rights violations created by the program. Congress began investigating communism in 1947 as well through an organization known as HUAC. Now, HUAC stood for House on Un-American Activities Committee. And HUAC was an investigative committee that had been created in 1938 to find and weed out subversives within American society. Armed with subpoena powers, HUAC called witnesses to testify about communist activities within the United States at the start of the Cold War. Now, in 1947, HUAC hosted a series of highly publicized hearings on the supposed communist infiltration of different parts of American society, but especially the film industry. Well-known screenwriters, directors, and producers were called before the committee to testify about their knowledge of communist activities, and actors such as Gary Cooper and future President Ronald Reagan testified before HUAC that there were communist elements within the movie business. However, 10 witnesses refused to cooperate and were charged with contempt. They cited that this was a violation of their First Amendment rights. Now, those 10 witnesses became known as the Hollywood 10. and they were sentenced between 6 to 12 months in jail for their failure to cooperate with HUAC. Caught up in the fear of the Second Red Scare, the heads of major Hollywood studios refused to speak out against these investigations, and many movie studios actually responded to these hearings by blacklisting anyone who was suspected of communist sympathies. So as a result, more than 200 people were blacklisted and unable to get work in the film industry because their names had been mentioned during HUAC's investigation, or maybe they themselves refused to name names of other people that they knew to be communist. Now, the activities of HUAC essentially destroyed the Communist Party USA, but it also had other more far-reaching effects as well. The anti-communist hysteria would significantly grow when HUAC in 1948 investigated a suspected Soviet spy named Elgar Hiss. So Elgar Hiss was a member of the State Department and had been present with FDR at the Yalta Conference. A former communist named Whittaker Chambers testified to HUAC that Hiss had given him top secret documents, which were to be passed along to the Soviet Union. Though Hiss denied the charges, one of the committee members, Richard Nixon, yes, future President Richard Nixon, was convinced that Hiss was guilty. HUAC was never able to fully prove that Elgar Hiss had spied for the Soviet Union, but with the help of Chambers' testimony, they were able to charge Hiss with perjury in 1950, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Now, in 1949, a number of events happened that really amplified American fears of communism. First, the Chinese nationalist government fell to the communist armies of Mao Zedong. Overnight, 500 million people had come under the influence of communism. Perhaps even more terrifying to the American public was the news that the Soviet Union had detonated their first atomic bomb in September of 1949. Americans had taken comfort in the fact that they were the sole nuclear power, and the threat of nuclear attack from the Soviet Union was now a real possibility, especially if the two nations were ever to go to war in the future. So what's more, the Soviet Union had managed to build an atomic bomb a full 3 years before American analysts believed that it was even possible. So many Americans within the United States suspected that the Soviet Union had had help. And these fears were actually confirmed when this guy pictured here, Klaus Fuchs, was arrested in 1950. So Fuchs was a German-born physicist who worked as a British scientist and later became part of the Manhattan Project. While developing the atomic bomb, Fuchs had been a Russian spy, passing along nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. Fuchs eventually admitted to espionage and was sentenced to 14 years in a British prison. However, his arrest set in motion a series of other arrests, including a New York couple named Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So the Rosenberg trial that followed in 1951 was covered extensively in the press, and the case ended with the conviction of both Julius and Ethel for conspiracy to commit espionage. Even though they were not charged with spying or treason, the judge in the case called their crime worse than murder. Furthermore, he argued that they had helped cause the Korean War, which had begun actually a year earlier. Citing that they may have cost 50,000 American lives in Korea, Judge Irvin Kaufman sentenced them both to die in the electric chair. In 1953, both were executed at Sing Sing prison. Of course, they had not caused the Korean War. In fact, the government had almost no evidence that Ethel Rosenberg was guilty at all. And some historians believe that she may have been indicted to put pressure on Julius Rosenberg to confess. However, in 1951, at the height of the Second Red Scare, and in that atmosphere of mass hysteria, many did not question the guilt of the Rosenbergs or the severity of their sentence. The Rosenberg case further fanned the flames of the Red Scare because it reinforced the idea that anyone in America could be a spy. If this couple who had a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old child could be spies, then anyone could. So that takes us to probably one of the most notorious parts of the Red Scare. And that is the idea of Joseph McCarthy and the greater concept of McCarthyism. In the anti-communist hysteria of the Second Red Scare, some people began to capitalize on American fears for their own personal gain. And no one was able to weaponize fear to a greater extent than Joseph McCarthy. So in 1950, McCarthy, who was a Republican senator, claimed that he had a list of 205 members of the Communist Party of the United States who worked for the State Department. Now, he never had any actual real evidence, but he waved this list around for the cameras, and it got him an enormous amount of attention. So based off the pressure that was being put on like people through like McCarthy, HUAC summoned 2,375 men and women, which was enough to cost them their jobs. 400 Americans went to jail, not having a fair trial. What lawyers, after all, would risk their career defending suspected communists? McCarthy, who was in general a bully, would basically threaten or abuse witnesses while he accused them of communist activities and communist sympathies. With the Korean War going on, many Americans believed him. And for a time, there was a great deal of public support for McCarthy and his activities. However, public opinion turned against McCarthy when he went too far. So McCarthy, by 1954, actually went too far by accusing the Army of being infiltrated by communists. The hearing, which became known as the Army McCarthy hearings, was actually televised, and it's at those television hearings that public opinion began to turn against him. The public saw him for what he was, which was a vicious bully and a liar. And by 1954, he was actually censured and forced out of public life. He died 3 years later from alcoholism. Now, the effects of McCarthyism would have a huge impact on America during this time period. 9,500 civil servants were dismissed and 15,000 people resigned. 600 teachers lost their jobs, and many actors and screenwriters were unable to ever work again. Charlie Chaplin, for example, the biggest Hollywood movie star of the pre-war years, actually left America in disgust. It also damaged America's reputation in the international world because we were supposed to be a country that stood for freedom, and here we were bullying people based off of no evidence on grounds that they might be communist. And because they might be communists, they might be disloyal. The term McCarthyism to this day represents basically slandering people's names, and basically building yourself up by using lies to tear other people down. So that takes us to kind of the effects of the Second Red Scare, and there are many. So the Second Red Scare is going to have a huge impact on American society. First of all, the very essence of the Second Red Scare challenged people's civil rights. Obviously, people were not allowed to join political organizations. They weren't allowed to freely speak out for fear that they might be accused of being a communist. It increased communist fear within America as well. A lot of people truly believe that communists were working against America and that there was a significant communist presence within American government. It also made America more conservative. There was basically fears that America was turning communist. And so anything that was slightly viewed as communist was struck down. A great example of this is Harry Truman's attempts to extend the New Deal with his program called the Fair Deal was actually destroyed by the Second Red Scare. So a big part of what Harry Truman wanted to do, he was actually one of the first presidents that wanted to propose a universal health care system. But people lobbied against it on the accusation that it was socialized medicine. And then lastly, it also encouraged an environment of conformity, because people that spoke out, people that dissented, were viewed with suspicion. And that is going to affect significantly the culture and the political environment of the 1950s. So that's all I got for you guys. Take care.